Commander Robert Hayes of the United States Navy sat in a dimly lit, high-security office at the Northwood headquarters in London, staring at a satellite map of the South Atlantic. It was May 1982. The world was watching what the American press had dubbed the Impossible War. To Hayes, an expert in carrier strike doctrine and anti-ship missile defense, it looked less like a war and more like a collective national suicide. "They have no chance," Hayes wrote in a classified cable to the Pentagon. "The British are sailing a makeshift fleet 8,000 miles from home into a South Atlantic winter. They are moving into the teeth of a modern, land-based air force equipped with French Exocet missiles. They are operating without a fixed-wing early warning system. By every law of naval mathematics, the Royal Navy will be decimated before they even reach the landing beaches. They are a 19th century empire trying to fight a 20th century war with guts and luck. Guts will not stop a Mach 2 missile." Hayes was not a cynic. He was a realist. He had seen the American naval simulations. In every computer model run by the Naval War College in Newport, the British lost. They lost because of a small, jagged piece of land called Pebble Island. Located off the north coast of West Falkland, Pebble Island had been seized by Argentine forces and turned into a forward operating base. They had established a grass airstrip and deployed a squadron of IA-58 Pucará ground attack aircraft. To a civilian, the Pucará looked like a relic, a twin turboprop plane that lacked the sleek lines of a Mirage jet. But to a tactical observer like Hayes, the Pucará was the most dangerous weapon in the Argentine arsenal. The Pucará was designed for counterinsurgency, Hayes explained. It was slow, agile, and rugged. It could take off from a muddy field and loiter over a target for hours. It was armed with 20mm cannons and rocket pods.
If the British tried to land their troops at San Carlos, these planes would be sitting right on their flank. They would shred the landing craft, destroy the helicopters, and turn the beachhead into a slaughterhouse. As long as those planes were on Pebble Island, the British invasion was dead on arrival. The Americans proposed a solution: a massive coordinated airstrike by the British Vulcan bombers, flying from Ascension Island. It was the American way, overwhelming firepower from distance. But the Vulcan raids, while psychologically impressive, were tactically useless. They were trying to hit a needle in a haystack with a sledgehammer. The Pucará aircraft remained untouched, tucked into revetments, fueled, and ready for the slaughter. It was into this atmosphere of looming disaster that Commander Hayes first encountered the men of D Squadron, 22nd SAS. He was at the Ascension Island staging base when the first elements of the regiment arrived. He expected to see the high-gloss precision of an elite NATO unit. He expected to see soldiers who looked like the recruitment posters for the US Navy SEALs. Instead, he saw a group of men who looked like they had been recruited from a high-security prison or a remote mountain village. They were a mess, Hayes recalled. Their uniforms were a mismatched collection of windproof smocks and civilian wool sweaters. They wore long, unkempt beards to protect their faces from the salt spray. They didn't march, they slouched. They spoke in a thick, abbreviated jargon that I could barely understand. I saw one NCO sharpening a survival knife with a piece of found stone. I saw another repairing his boots with industrial tape. I turned to my liaison officer and said, "You're sending these survivors of a shipwreck to save your fleet." The liaison officer, a quiet Royal Marine colonel, didn't smile. He just looked at the men of D Squadron and said, "Robert, those aren't survivors. Those are the architects of the environment. You measure strength in hull displacement and radar cross-section. They measure it in the distance a man can walk in a storm without dying." Hayes remained unconvinced. He had seen the Brecon Beacons files. He knew about the SAS selection, the grueling marches over the Welsh mountains, the long drag, the thinking soldier philosophy. But he believed that in the era of the Exocet missile, the long drag was an anachronism. "I told them that Pebble Island was a fortress," Hayes said. "The Argentines had a garrison of over 100 men. They had radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. They had minefields. They had a natural defensive perimeter of cliffs and freezing water. I told the SAS major, a man named Cedric Delves, that he would need at least a battalion of paratroopers and a 24-hour naval bombardment to take that airfield." Delves, a man whose quiet intensity reminded Hayes of a predator at rest, looked at the satellite photo of the island. He didn't ask for a battalion. He didn't ask for a bombardment. He asked for a Sea King helicopter to drop them in the water 8 miles away, Hayes recalled. He said, "If we send a battalion, they'll hear us coming. If we send a bombardment, they'll just move the planes. We'll go in small, we'll go in quiet, and we'll destroy the aircraft by hand." By hand. To Hayes, the phrase sounded like madness. In 1982, you didn't destroy an air force by hand. You used Maverick missiles or laser-guided bombs. You didn't ask 40 men to swim through an Antarctic ocean and walk across a bog-filled island in the dark to place individual charges on engine housings. "I told my superiors at the Pentagon that the British had lost their minds," Hayes said. "I told them that the SAS was about to attempt a 19th century commando raid against a 20th century garrison, and that the only result would be 40 more bodies in the South Atlantic." But Hayes didn't understand the institutional memory of the regiment. He didn't understand that the SAS had been founded in the North African desert for exactly this purpose, to destroy aircraft on the ground. He didn't realize that for the men of D Squadron, the Exocet missile was just noise. The real war was the one between the human will and the landscape. As the British task force moved south, deeper into the freezing heart of the South Atlantic winter, Hayes was invited to stay on the flagship, HMS Hermes. He watched the planning sessions. He saw the boat troop operators studying the tides and the mountain troop analyzing the rock formations of Pebble Island. He saw no computers. He saw no high-tech simulations. He saw men with maps, pencils, and a level of patience that made his skin crawl. They were waiting for the storm, Hayes noted. The weather was turning into a nightmare. 60-mile-per-hour winds, freezing sleet, visibility near zero. To the Royal Navy, the storm was a threat. To the SAS, the storm was a gift. They knew the Argentines wouldn't be looking for them in a gale. They knew that technology fails in a storm, but a man who has been flattened by the beacons does not. On the night of May 14, 1982, the 20-minute miracle of the future was still a dream, but the 8-mile grave of Pebble Island was about to begin. Hayes stood on the deck of the Hermes, the wind whipping his face, as the Sea King helicopters rose into the pitch-black sky. They looked like they were flying into a void, Hayes said. 45 men against a fortress, no backup, no extraction plan if the weather turned, just the silence and the cold. I was convinced I was watching the end of the SAS. What Robert Hayes didn't know was that he was about to witness the moment where the fading power of Britain would prove that a pair of human hands and a thinking soldier could achieve what a billion-dollar machine could not. The mathematics of the Exocet were about to be replaced by the geometry of the hand-placed charge.
And as the helicopters disappeared into the sleet, the American witness began to realize that he didn't know nearly as much about the limits of the human being as he thought he did. The transition from the hangar deck of HMS Hermes to the interior of a Sea King HC-4 helicopter was, as Commander Robert Hayes described it, a descent into a different state of matter. On the ship, there was the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee, and the comforting vibration of 28,000 tons of steel. Inside the helicopter, There was only the smell of hydraulic fluid, the deafening roar of the Rolls-Royce Gnome engines, and the absolute, terrifying darkness of a South Atlantic gale. "I watched them load," Hayes recalled. 45 men. They didn't talk. They didn't do the high fives or the pre-combat rituals I'd seen with the SEAL teams. They sat in the red glow of the cabin lights, their rucksacks between their knees, their faces covered in a thick, oily black cream that made them look like statues carved from coal. I saw one man, a sergeant named Mac, checking his watch. His hands were perfectly steady. The helicopter was pitching 30 degrees in the wind, bouncing off air pockets like a tin can in a dryer, and this man was as calm as a librarian. That was when I first felt the professional chill of the regiment. They weren't just prepared, they were indifferent to the danger. The plan for the insertion was a nightmare. The Sea Kings would fly nap of the earth, skimming the waves at less than 50 feet to stay below the Argentine radar at Port Stanley. In a storm with 60-mile-per-hour gusts, this was suicide. One wrong twitch of the pilot's collective, one unexpected downdraft, and 45 of the British military's most valuable assets would be swallowed by an ocean so cold that survival time was measured in minutes. The American Manual for Helicopter Operations in 1982 stated that these conditions were non-permissive, Hayes noted. You don't fly these missions in a gale. You wait for a window. But the British didn't have a window. They had a fleet that was being hunted by Exocet missiles. They had to kill the Pukaras on Pebble Island before the main invasion began, or the war was over before it started. The SAS was the only card they had left to play, and they were throwing it into a hurricane. The helicopters didn't land on a cleared LZ. They performed a hover drop on the rugged, peat-soaked ground of West Falkland, several miles from the target. The moment the wheels touched the mud, the SAS operators vanished into the sleet. Hayes, back in the Northwood Operations Center, watched the telemetry. They were off the birds in less than 30 seconds. The helicopters pulled away and then silence. For the next 6 hours, 45 men simply ceased to exist. We had the most advanced satellite tracking systems available to the NATO alliance, and we couldn't find them. They had become part of the Antarctic static. The 8-mile grave had begun. To understand what those 45 men were doing in the dark, you have to understand the specific DNA of the SAS forged in the Brecon beacons. The Falklands in May is a landscape of wet cold. It is a temperature that hovers just above freezing, combined with a 100% humidity and a wind that strips the heat from a man's core with surgical efficiency. In the American system, Hayes observed, we spent millions on Gore-Tex and synthetic insulation. The British in 1982 were wearing cotton windproof smocks and woolly pulley sweaters. It looked like 1940s technology. But what I didn't realize was that their protection wasn't in the fabric. It was in the thermoregulation of the mind. The SAS operators were moving through a landscape of peat-bog, a surface that feels like walking on a sponge soaked in ice water. Every step requires 3 times the energy of a normal stride. Every time you stop, the moisture in your clothing begins to freeze. They were carrying 60-pound Bergens, Hayes noted. But they weren't just carrying ammunition. They were carrying the geometry of the raid. Each man had his specific task. The breach team with the plastic explosives, the cover team with the L7A2 general-purpose machine guns, and the mortar team to provide the distraction. They were walking 8 miles through a storm, over terrain that would break a professional athlete, just to reach the start line. The thinking soldier philosophy was being tested in its most primal form. While an American Ranger company would rely on a company command to navigate and keep the pace, each 4-man SAS patrol was navigating its own route. They were micro-navigating, using the contours of the hills and the feel of the wind to stay on course. I heard a report later from a sergeant who was on that march, Hayes said. He said the wind was so loud they couldn't hear each other speak from 2 feet away. They moved in a file, connected only by a piece of white tape on the rucksack of the man in front. If you lost that tape, you were gone. You were alone in the Antarctic dark. As the clock ticked toward 2 o'clock, the 45 men reached their observation post, OP, a jagged ridge overlooking the Pebble Island airfield. Hayes watched the burst transmission come through on the secure terminal. It was a single compressed signal that lasted less than a second. Target in sight, garrison active, weather, extreme, proceeding. Hayes looked at the map. They were there. After 8 miles of walking through a gale that had grounded every other helicopter in the task force, they were in position. I asked my British counterpart how they could possibly be ready to fight after a march like that. He just looked at me and said, "Robert, they've been training for this since they were 20. The march is just the commute to the office." From the ridge, the SAS operators could see the Pucará aircraft. They were tucked into earth-walled revetments, fueled and armed with rocket pods. To Hayes, watching from a distance, these planes were the exterminators of the British fleet. To the SAS operators looking through their binoculars, they were just targets to be processed. But the Argentine garrison was not asleep. There were over 100 men on the island, soldiers from the 6th Infantry Regiment and naval personnel. They had radar-guided 35mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns that could be leveled to fire horizontally. They had minefields protecting the approaches to the airfield. The geometry was impossible, Hayes said. You have 45 men attacking a fortified airfield with a 3-to-1 defender advantage. In any American war game, the attackers are wiped out. The only way to win was to achieve total, absolute surprise. But how do you achieve surprise when you have to walk across a flat, open airfield in the dark? The answer lay in the vertical hammer of the British philosophy. They weren't going to attack the garrison, they were going to bypass the soldier to kill the machine. The SAS Major Delves split his force into 3 groups. The mountain troop would move onto the airfield itself to place the charges. The D troop would establish a base of fire on the ridge, and a small elite element would move toward the garrison to keep them pinned down with noise and distraction. It was a gamble on the Argentine psychology, Hayes noted. The British knew that in a storm like this, the Argentine soldiers would be huddled in their bunkers. They wouldn't be patrolling. They would be trusting the weather to protect them. The SAS wasn't just using the storm for cover, they were using it as a psychological weapon. As the operators began their final descent from the ridge, Hayes felt a knot in his stomach. He was a man of the computer age, a man who believed in the electronic order of battle. But he was watching a war that was being fought with guts and cold steel. I turned to the Royal Marine Colonel and asked him what would happen if they were compromised, Hayes recalled. He told me, "Robert, if they're compromised, they'll fight. And God help the Argentines, because my boys are very, very angry about the cold." The 20-minute miracle was still hours away, but the 8-mile grave was almost complete. The SAS was at the edge of the airfield. The charges were primed. The Pukaras were waiting. And as the 45 men began their crawl across the frozen mud, Robert Hayes realized that the mathematics of the exocet were about to be rewritten by a man with a piece of plastic explosive and a willingness to die for a standard. At 6:45 on the morning of May 15, 1982, the world of Commander Robert Hayes was divided into 2 distinct realities. In the first reality, the one inside the operations room of HMS Hermes, there was the clinical hum of the Plessy-type 992 radar and the orderly flickering of green tactical symbols. In the second reality, 45 men were lying face down in the frozen peat of Pebble Island, 300 meters from a fortified airfield.
waiting for a signal that would determine the fate of the British task force. I watched the clock, Hayes recalled. The silence in the ops room was physical. It felt like the air had been pumped out of the room. We knew the SAS were in position, but we had no visual. We were betting the entire war on the assumption that 45 men could walk onto a flat, open runway and destroy an air force without being slaughtered. By every rule of engagement I had ever learned at Annapolis, this was a failure in the making. You don't send infantry against an airfield without air superiority.
It was tactical madness. But on the ground, the madness was being managed by the thinking soldier. Major Cedric Delves had reached the forming up point, FUP. His men were exhausted, their bodies on the verge of hypothermic shutdown after the 8-mile march through the gale. But the moment the airfield came into view, the metabolic shift occurred. An SAS sergeant once told me that when the target is in sight, the cold disappears, Hayes noted. The brain switches from survival mode to processing mode. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were technicians of destruction. The coordination was a masterclass in the vertical hammer. To achieve surprise, the SAS didn't just rush the airfield. They used a decoy of force. 2 miles offshore, the County-class destroyer HMS Glamorgan was positioned in the swell. Her job was to provide the noise. At 700, the Glamorgan opened fire with her twin 4.5-inch guns, Hayes said. But she didn't target the planes. She targeted the Argentine garrison barracks on the far side of the island. It was a psychological feint. The high explosive shells, screaming through the storm, forced the Argentine soldiers to dive into their bunkers. They assumed a full-scale naval bombardment was beginning. They weren't looking at the runway. They were looking at the ceiling, waiting for the next hit. Under the cover of the naval thunder, the SAS demolition teams moved. They didn't run. They moved in a low-profile glide, pairs of men carrying rucksacks filled with PE4 plastic explosive and L-delay fuses. Hayes watched the radio logs. There was no chatter. The coordination was done through pre-arranged light signals and the rhythm of the breach. The Pucará aircraft were the primary targets, Hayes explained. The SAS knew that a rocket or a grenade might only damage a wing. They wanted total destruction. To achieve that, you have to place the charge directly on the engine housing or the cockpit floor. This required a man to physically climb onto the aircraft, scrape away the ice, and attach the PE4. It was a task that required the steady hands of a surgeon, while a battle was raging 50 meters away. The demolition teams moved from plane to plane. One man would provide cover with an M16A1 and an M203 grenade launcher. The SAS had chosen American weaponry for this raid because of its lighter weight and higher rate of fire compared to the standard British SLR. The second man would plant the charges. I saw the first flashes on the horizon through the ship's long-range optics, Hayes recalled. But they weren't the explosions yet. They were the muzzle flashes of the Argentine sentries who had finally spotted the movement. The 20-minute miracle had just become a firefight. The Argentine garrison had realized that the naval shells were a distraction. A platoon of infantry emerged from the bunkers and began pouring fire toward the runway with FNFAL rifles and MAG machine guns. More dangerously, the 35mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were leveled. These were radar-guided cannons that could fire 550 rounds per minute. At ground level, they were meat grinders. The geometry shifted instantly, Hayes noted. The SAS were caught in the open on a flat runway. In the US doctrine, this is the point of no return. You abort, or you call in a massive airstrike. The SAS did neither. They executed a blitz suppression. The SAS cover troop on the ridge unleashed their own hell. They were armed with L7A2 general-purpose machine guns, the Gympie. They weren't just firing, they were painting the line. They used tracer rounds to direct the fire of the HMS Glamorgan, calling in 4.5-inch shells to within 100 meters of their own demolition teams. "It was the most aggressive use of naval gunfire I have ever seen," Hayes said, his voice reflecting a lingering awe. "They were using a destroyer as a sniper rifle. The shells were falling so close to the SAS teams that the ground was shaking them off the planes. But they didn't stop. They kept planting the charges." Inside the ops room, Hayes watched the target status board. Pucará 1, destroyed. Pucará 2, destroyed. Skyvan transport, destroyed. One by one, the Argentine air threat to the British task force was being systematically deleted by hand. The SAS operators were moving through the fire, climbing onto the wings, setting the fuses for a simultaneous detonation, and moving to the next. The technical precision was terrifying, Hayes noted. In the middle of a gale, under fire from 35mm cannons, they were calculating the exact amount of PE4 needed to shear a turbine shaft. They weren't just blowing things up, they were engineering a failure. As the 20-minute mark approached, Major Delves gave the order for the blow. The demolition teams withdrew to the edge of the runway. A second later, the airfield erupted. 11 aircraft, 6 Pucaras, 4 mentor trainers, and a short skyvan turned into pillars of fire. The secondary explosions from the fuel tanks lit up the Pebble Island sky, turning the Antarctic night into a surreal orange midday. The Pucará threat was gone, Hayes said. In 20 minutes, 45 men had achieved what the Vulcan bombers and the entire Royal Navy air arm had failed to do. They had decapitated the Argentine air attack capability for the San Carlos landings. But the raid wasn't over. The thinking soldier knew that the most dangerous part of any mission is the withdrawal. The Argentine garrison was now fully awake, enraged, and closing in. The SAS were still 8 miles from their extraction point, their ammunition was running low, and the storm was reaching its peak. "I turned to the Royal Marine Colonel," Hayes recalled. "I told him, 'They've done it. Now get them out. Send the Sea Kings.'" The colonel didn't move. He pointed to the weather radar. The gale had intensified. The Dolphin flight was grounded. The Sea Kings couldn't fly. Hayes felt a cold pit in his stomach. The 45 men were trapped on an island with 100 vengeful Argentine soldiers, no air cover and no escape. The 8-mile grave they had walked through to reach the airfield was now their only path back. But this time, they would be walking it with the enemy at their heels. That was the moment I realized the true cost of the SAS philosophy, Hayes noted. They don't have a safety net. They don't have a plan B. They only have the long drag and the man next to them. I was convinced that the 20-minute miracle was about to end in a massacre at the water's edge. What Robert Hayes was about to see in the final phase of the raid would redefine his understanding of resilience forever. The different species were about to show him how they handle a non-permissive withdrawal in the heart of a hurricane. At 7:25, the airfield at Pebble Island was a funeral pyre. 11 aircraft were burning with such intensity that the heat was melting the frozen peat beneath them, sending plumes of oily black smoke into the screaming gale. But for Commander Robert Hayes, watching the infrared flicker from the bridge of the HMS Hermes, the fire wasn't a sign of victory. It was a beacon that had revealed the exact location of 45 men who were now trapped in the open. The 20-minute miracle was over, and the 8-mile nightmare had begun, Hayes recalled. In American doctrine, once the target is destroyed, the extraction is the highest priority. You bring in the birds, you provide a wall of suppressive fire, and you get your people out. But the weather had other plans. The Sea King pilots reported wind speeds of 70 knots over the ridge. At those speeds, a helicopter isn't an aircraft. It's a kite without a string.
The birds were grounded. The SAS was on its own. The situation was tactically terminal.
45 men were on a flat runway, low on ammunition, exhausted by a march that would have killed a normal soldier. And now they were facing a garrison of over 100 Argentine regulars who were no longer confused by the naval bombardment. The Argentines were moving to enclose the airfield. The 35mm Oerlikon guns, though hampered by the smoke, were now sweeping the runway in search of the ghosts who had burned their air force. I turned to the Royal Marine Colonel and told him we had to do something, Hayes said. I suggested a second naval bombardment to cover their retreat. The Colonel just looked at me with that cold, institutional calm and said, Robert, a bombardment now would hit our own boys as likely as the enemy. They know the way back. They just have to walk it. They just have to walk it. To Hayes, the statement sounded like a death sentence. To walk 8 miles through an Antarctic storm while being hunted by an enraged garrison carrying casualties and equipment was beyond the limit of human endurance. But it was here, in the freezing mud of Pebble Island, that the thinking soldier philosophy revealed its true purpose. Major Cedric Delves didn't call for a rescue. He didn't ask for a change in the plan. He signaled the peel. The SAS peel is a work of rhythmic violence, Hayes explained. It's a tactical maneuver where one element provides a base of fire while the other moves back. Then they switch. It's like a mechanical wave of lead. Even on the monitors you could see the discipline. They weren't running. They were recycling the line. Every time an Argentine squad tried to close the gap, they walked into a concentrated burst from an L7A2 machine gun. The British were picking their shots. They were husbanding their ammunition because they knew the long drag back to the coast would take hours. As the 45 men moved off the runway and into the rising ground of the interior, the storm became their primary enemy. The sleet had turned into a full whiteout. Visibility dropped to less than 3 meters. In these conditions, the Argentine search parties became disoriented. They were used to the barracks, to the warmth, and to the technology of their radar. They couldn't read the ground. The SAS operators, however, had been flattened by the Brecon beacons, Hayes noted. In the regiment, you are taught to navigate by the feel of the slope under your boots and the direction of the wind against your cheek. It's a primitive, sensory form of land navigation that doesn't require a GPS or a map you can't see in the dark. They were moving through a whiteout as if they had a clear path, maintaining a pace of 3 kilometers per hour over terrain that looked like the surface of the moon. Hayes remembered a specific moment during the retreat, a radio burst that came through the Northwood terminal. It wasn't a call for help. It was a status update on a casualty. One of the operators, a corporal named B, had been hit in the leg by a fragment from an Oerlikon shell. In any other special operations unit, this would have slowed the entire team to a crawl. A man down in a whiteout usually means a defensive perimeter and a halt. I heard the patrol commander's report, Hayes said. He didn't sound stressed. He said, casualty stabilized. He's walking. We're maintaining the interval. I found out later that the corporal had refused a stretcher. He knew that 4 men carrying a stretcher would be a massive, slow-moving target in the snow. So he let his teammates prop him up, and he walked. He walked 4 miles on a shattered leg because the standard of the regiment dictated that the mission speed was more important than the individual's pain. It was a biological rejection of the victim status. This was the different species in its purest form. The ability to decouple the brain from the body's pain receptors in service of the geometry of the retreat. Back on the Hermes, Hayes was watching the intercept assets. Argentine patrols from the far side of the island were trying to cut off the SAS at a narrow choke point known as the Big Pond.
If they reached that point first, the SAS would be pinned against the water and slaughtered. The Argentines were using vehicles, panhard armored cars, Hayes noted. On paper they had the speed. They should have reached the pond 30 minutes before the British, but the storm that grounded our helicopters also drowned their engines. The peat-bog swallowed the armored cars. The technology failed. The machine died. But the men from Hereford, they just kept walking. The SAS reached the choke point 10 minutes before the Argentine infantry. They didn't just pass through, they established a kill zone. Major Delves knew the enemy was following the logic of the map, Hayes explained. The Argentines assumed the British would be running for their lives. Instead, the British stopped. They set up 2 machine gun nests in the rocks and waited. When the Argentine lead element arrived, expecting to find a fleeing enemy, they found a wall of steel. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The Argentine pursuit was shattered. The psychological impact was so total that the garrison stopped the chase. They decided that the ghosts weren't worth dying for in a storm. By 5 o'clock, the 45 men reached the extraction beach. They were gaunt. Their faces were grey with exhaustion, and their uniforms were frozen stiff. They had walked 16 miles in 24 hours, fought a battle against a garrison 4 times their size, destroyed an air force, and carried their wounded through a hurricane. I stood on the bridge as the report came in, Hayes said. The weather had cleared just enough for a marginal extraction. The Sea Kings were spinning up.
I asked the Royal Marine Colonel if they would be sending a medical team to the beach to help them onto the helicopters. He just looked at me and said, "Robert, they'll get on the birds the same way they got off, on their own feet. They're BS. They don't need a handhold." As the helicopters finally lifted off the Pebble Island mud, carrying the 45 ghosts back to the fleet, Commander Robert Hayes realized that his mathematics of the exocet were fundamentally flawed. He had spent his career believing that the future of war belonged to the person with the best sensor, the best missile, and the best computer. But Pebble Island proved that there is a blind spot in every technology, Hayes concluded. There is a space where the machine dies and the satellite goes blind. And in that space, the only thing that matters is the man who has been trained to endure until the world ends. The British didn't win because they had a better plan. They won because they had a standard that the enemy couldn't even imagine. But the final part of the story wasn't the extraction. It was the legacy of the 8-mile grave. As the SAS operators returned to the Hermes, they didn't go to the infirmary. They went to the hangar deck, cleaned their weapons, and began planning the next mission. And Robert Hayes was about to witness the moment where the different species would pass their cold surgical fire to the heart of the American military, a lesson that would eventually lead to the 17-second miracle in Baghdad 20 years later. The return of D Squadron to HMS Hermes was not marked by the blare of trumpets or a welcoming committee on the flight deck. At 7:45 on May 15, 1982, as the Sea King helicopters touched down in the grey, salt-sprayed dawn, the ship was already moving into its action stations routine. The fleet was still under the shadow of the exocet threat. Commander Robert Hayes stood on the observation gallery, watching the 45 men disembark. He expected to see the theatrics of victory, men shouting, exhausted soldiers collapsing, perhaps a sense of relief. Instead, he saw a funeral procession of ghosts. They didn't look like they had just won a war, Hayes recalled. They looked like they were part of the machinery of the ship. They walked off the ramp, their burgans still heavy with unused equipment, their faces still caked in that oily black grease. One man stopped to help the wounded Corporal B onto a stretcher, and then he simply walked toward the hangar deck to begin his after-action maintenance. There was no adrenaline dump,
There was no high. It was as if they had just finished a routine shift at a factory. This was the most chilling thing I'd seen yet. The total normalization of the impossible. In the hangar deck, the SAS operators didn't go to their bunks. For the next 3 hours, Hayes watched them through the open gantry. They sat in small circles, cleaning their M16s, stripping their L7A2 machine guns, and drying out their maps. They were resetting the system. I spoke to Major Cedric Delves later that afternoon, Hayes said. He was sitting in a small, cramped office, drinking a cup of tea that looked like battery acid. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. I told him that the Pentagon would be studying this raid for decades. I told him that he had achieved a 100% target destruction rate with 0 fatalities. I called it a miracle. Delves didn't even smile. He just looked at his tea and said, "It wasn't a miracle, Robert. It was just the geometry of the task. We knew the wind, we knew the ground, and we knew the men. If you get those 3 things right, the result is just a matter of arithmetic." Arithmetic.
Hayes realized that for the SAS, the different species wasn't about being superhuman, it was about being ultra-rational. While the American system was built to provide a soldier with every possible tool to overcome a lack of experience, the British system invested everything into the experience itself. The raid on Pebble Island saved the British invasion, Hayes noted in his final assessment. Without that raid, the Pukaras would have decimated the landing force at San Carlos. The British would have been forced to retreat, and the war would have ended in a humiliated withdrawal. 45 men with hand-placed charges did what an entire carrier strike group could not. They didn't just kill planes, they killed the enemy's strategic options. The San Carlos landings, which took place a week later, were a success. The Argentine Air Force fought with incredible bravery, but they were missing their surgical instrument, the Pebble Island Squadron. The British established their beachhead, and the long, bloody march to Port Stanley began. But for Robert Hayes, the real legacy of Pebble Island was not found in the history books. It was found in the secret change of heart within the American military establishment. When I returned to the United States, I was summoned to a closed-door briefing with the Joint Chiefs, Hayes recalled. They wanted to know why our satellite imagery had failed to track the SAS. They wanted to know how the unscientific British could navigate a whiteout that would have grounded a Delta Force team. I told them, "We are building the most expensive military in history, but we are neglecting the primary sensor. We are training our men to use tools, but the British are training their men to be the tool." This realization would eventually lead to the Great Realignment of the 1990s. The lessons of Pebble Island and the long drag were slowly integrated into the training of the 75th Ranger Regiment and Delta Force. The American Special Operations Command began to look for the thinking soldier, the man who could function when the GPS was jammed and the satellite link was dead. 20 years later, Hayes noted, when Marcus Dunlap watched the 17-second clearance in Baghdad, he was seeing the direct descendant of the Pebble Island Raid. He was seeing the result of a doctrine that values tempo over mass and instinct over technology. The SAS didn't change their standard for the 21st century. They just waited for the rest of us to realize that the standard was right all along. Commander Robert Hayes retired from the Navy in 1994. He never forgot the 45 ghosts on the deck of the Hermes. On his wall at his home in Maryland, he kept a small framed piece of aluminum, a fragment of a Pucará engine housing, given to him by the SAS major before he left the South Atlantic. "People ask me why I keep a piece of junk on my wall," Hayes said, his voice reflecting the quiet wisdom of a man who had seen the impossible become routine.
I tell them it's not junk. It's a reminder that a human hand and a cold heart can change the course of history. It's a reminder that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't an exocet missile. It's a man who has decided that he's going to keep walking until the job is done. The raid on Pebble Island remains one of the most successful special operations in the history of warfare. It was a victory of the 8-mile grave over the fortified fortress. It was a victory of the thinking soldier over the machine. And as the sun sets over the Brecon Beacons today, a new generation of candidates is beginning the long drag. They are cold, they are wet, and they are alone. They don't have a safety net, and they don't have a plan B, but they have the standard. And they have the memory of the 45 men who walked through a hurricane to prove that the different species doesn't just survive, they win. Because who dares, wins.